encouragement before I've said anything. I do appreciate Scott's introduction. I have got my line manager at Tabor is a guy called Stephen Spence, and I think Stephen takes great joy in the introductions that he has to do when I give a public lecture. And Stephen whacks eloquently about my abilities and about my writing and all those kinds of things. The only problem is that he's by the time I'm kind of walking up to the stage, he's set the bar kind of up here. And I fear that all I can do is kind of fail to live up to expectations from that regard. So thank you for your more restrained welcome, Scott. Hopefully that means if we start kind of in the middle, we'll go up from here onwards. We'll see how
all yours, mate.
Yeah, okay. So good evening, thank you. I do appreciate everyone making the effort to come out tonight. It's certainly not the most conducive of environments to being out and about, but I trust God will honour the time that you've set aside, and this will be an opportunity for you to learn and grow as we seek to grapple with what is in some ways a very strange, a very obscure, very foreign, a very confronting word that we find in the Old Testament prophets. Okay. Maybe it's just the weird circles that I hang out in as an Old Testament lecturer. Maybe it's just the magazines that I read. But you don't have to go too far sometimes, either in Christian magazines or on the internet, before you start to see signs like this. Okay. Ukraine in Bible Prophecy, 2015 Bible Prophecy Conference, Prophetic Island, the sign of the end times, discerning today's headlines. The Antichrist is living in the White House. Yeah. All of these kinds of signs reveal a certain interpretive framework when it comes to interpreting biblical prophecy, including Old Testament prophecy. These signs suggest that the essential way that we go about reading Old Testament prophecy is to consider how are the prophetic words being fulfilled in our day. Okay, that's the interpretive framework. That's how we read them. When we read Old Testament prophecy, what we're doing is we're looking to see how the words that they were speaking are coming true in the events, the people, the challenges of our day. To put it another way, this framework suggests that Old Testament prophecy essentially or primarily speaks of contemporary events. Okay, they're speaking of contemporary events. Furthermore, this gives us an interpretive framework about how we read the prophets, but it also suggests a certain way of viewing the prophets themselves. It suggests that the prophets are to be understood in a certain way. Prophets are, and we finish that sentence, it also begins with P-R-E, okay? Prophets are predictors. Okay, this is essentially what this framework suggests. That the way we understand the prophets is that they are predictors of the far distant future. Okay. The questions I want to consider tonight is this the best way for viewing the Old Testament prophets and approaching these texts? And what and how might the Old Testament prophets speak to us today? Now, before I start to address those questions, before I give you my take on this issue, I want to have a look at three ways in which the prophets have been approached throughout Christian history. Okay? So have a look at the past, what can we learn from it? The first way that prophets have been approached is as social reformers. Okay? The prophets have been viewed as social reformers. This view suggests that prophets are primarily political and social activists. Okay? And that the goal of the Old Testament prophets was to bring about change within their society. Okay? Are we familiar with this? This is a fairly typical understanding, especially within liberal circles, that the prophets are basically early advocates of social justice. Okay? And that they're defenders of the marginalised. They're concerned with bringing equality to their society, making sure the marginalised are looked after. And so if I was to use an image to kind of capture this approach to the prophets, we might want to say that the prophets are like someone like Mark someone who is concerned with social justice, social welfare, of looking after the marginalised. Okay? So the prophets are ancient equivalents of Martin Luther King, or to flip it the other way, that we view Martin Luther King as a modern equivalent of an Old Testament prophet. Okay. Now, I would want to affirm that the Old Testament prophets are concerned with issues of social justice. Okay? That's legitimate. Amos is not backward in his condemnation of those who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe, who push aside the needy in the gate. That's a quote from Amos 5:12. Likewise, Isaiah can exhort the people of Judah, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. This is a concern that the prophets have. At the same time, though, I think we need to realise that this view, this approach, carries with it some problems or some limitations, perhaps. Essentially, my problem with this is it's a far too narrow understanding of the prophets. Okay? It's not that it's an unbiblical, it's not that it's not biblical, but the problem is that it's not biblical enough in terms of the Old Testament prophets. Okay? This understanding is too narrow. It's too narrow in two senses. Okay? First of all, the prophets are concerned with social change, but they're actually concerned with more than just social change. Okay? At their heart, they are concerned with the cultic and the religious life of the people. And so, yes, they are concerned with how we treat our neighbours, because that's actually part of the religious life of ancient Israel. How we treat our neighbours is important. Okay? The covenant that we have entered into with God, that defines us as the people of God, isn't simply about us relating to God, it's also about how we relate to our neighbour as well. So yes, they're concerned with how we treat our neighbour, but they've got a broader concern. They're concerned with how we worship God. They're concerned with the sacrificial system. They're concerned with idolatry. In fact, they're just as likely to launch into an accusation against idolatry as they are an accusation against social injustice. Okay? So by taking this lens as the primary way through which we see the prophets, we've reduced their message down to a message about simply social justice. Okay? That's important. That's there. But their message is broader than that. They're concerned with the religious life of the nation as a whole, and so how we treat each other is important, but it's also how important how we relate to God. How we relate, that we don't commit idolatry, that the sacrificial system is working as it should. Whatever. So it's too narrow an understanding just simply to go with that. The other problem with this kind of understanding is that it fails to reckon with the profoundly theological basis for the prophet's activity. Why are the prophets concerned with social justice? Okay. It's not, as this image may suggest, it's not simply to create a more humane society. Okay? And that's the problem, I think, when we work with the social justice. That the reason that they were doing what they were doing is because they wanted to create a humane, just society. Why are they actually doing what they're doing? It's not because they want to create a humane society necessarily, it's because they've got a certain vision of God. Okay? And they've got a certain vision of the expectations that God places on his people. There is a theological basis for their ministry. They have a view of God, they have a view of the requirements that God places on his people. And so in short, there is a theological basis, there is a theological dimension to their ministry that if we simply approach them as proponents of social justice, may get ignored. Now that doesn't necessarily happen when I put the picture of Martin Luther King on the board, and that's perhaps why it's not the best example, because Martin Luther King was a Baptist minister who was shaped by a view of God which led him into the changes that he was calling for. But that's not always the case with social justice movements. Okay? They're not always shaped and driven by a certain view of not, but the prophets are. So the reason, this has got a lot of strength to it. It does point to a key emphasis within the prophets, but at the same time it's too narrow to be the only way through which we read. Okay. So that's one way, though, throughout church history that has been emphasised, to view the prophets as social reformers. The second is to view them as heralds of the Messiah. Okay, the prophets are heralds of the Messiah. This view was very common in the early church, but it's still found in the contemporary church as well. What are the prophets on about? Predicting Jesus, okay, predicting the Messiah. That they announced, that they foretold the coming of the Messiah. That was their primary mission, that was their primary ministry. This here is an image that captures this. This is a picture of, at the front, it's Isaiah. And can you see what Isaiah is looking towards, what Isaiah's ministry is all about? In the top left corner, there's a picture of Mary and Jesus. In the middle, there is Jesus' death. On the far right-hand side, as I look at it, there is Jesus' victory and his defeat of Satan. What is Isaiah on about, all according to that image there? He's a predictor of the Messiah. He's a predictor of the birth, the death and resurrection of Jesus. Again, there are things that I want to affirm, but also question regarding this approach. In terms of affirming, I want to say that the prophets do this. The prophets do predict the Messiah. This is something that the New Testament authors, Matthew in particular, makes clear. If you look at the first 4 chapters of Matthew, you will find repeated citations of Old Testament passages suggesting that Jesus constitutes the fulfillment of this. It is in fact the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Therefore, I wouldn't want to deny it and say that it has no place. It's got an element of truth to it, just like the social justice element. Nevertheless, I think it's problematic if this becomes the primary lens through which the prophets, okay? This is problematic if it's the primary way through which we view the prophets. This too is problematic if it's the primary way through which we read the prophets. Okay? The vast majority of Old Testament prophecy is not concerned with predicting the Messiah. Okay? It's much more concerned with contemporary events in the life of the nation of Israel. And so the fundamental problem, I guess, with this image is that we have allowed an element within prophecy, prediction of the Messiah, to come and define what prophecy as a whole is about. Okay? And I think that's problematic, because the vast majority of prophecy isn't actually concerned with predicting the Messiah. So, one image, prophets as social reformers. A second image, prophets as heralds of the Messiah. Strengths and weaknesses to each of us. The third image that we can work with is the prophets as predictors of the present. Okay, so prophets as predictors of the present. This view connects with the images that I showed at the start of the lecture. Okay? This approach suggests that the prophets are responsible for announcing things which are taking place in our day, taking place in our time, or which are about to take place shortly. So we're about to encounter the Armageddon, or we're about to see the battle that will bring an end to the world as we know it. According to this image, or the image that we might want to use here, is that the prophets are figures like Nostradamus. Okay? People who saw into the future, people who saw into our present and predicted events that are taking place in our day. Okay. We might think that this is a new approach to the prophets, but this is actually something that has been present throughout history. Okay? It's actually nothing new. There has been a tendency throughout Christian history to interpret the words and visions of the prophets with reference to the events of the interpreter's own day. Okay? So there's a tendency that we read prophecy throughout history, and what we see there, we interpret it in terms of the events, the people, the transformations that are taking place in our own day. I'll give you one example. This here is a pictorial representation of Daniel's vision in chapter 7. Okay? Context is that Daniel has a dream, he has a vision, and he sees 4 great beasts emerging out of the sea. Each looks like a different animal or a combination of animals. Some of them are quite weird actually if you look up there. The 4th beast was terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had 10 horns, and then another horn appears with eyes and a mouth. Fascinating thing is to look at the way that this creature has been interpreted throughout history. For Melanchthon, who was an early Protestant reformer, he identified this 4th beast with Islam, with the Muslim Turks of his day, which was a threat to Roman Europe. For Luther, anyone want to guess who he identified the 4th beast with? The Catholic Church, that's right, the Roman papacy. They are the 4th beast. Why? Because that was the concern for his day. In fact, according to Adam Clarke, who's the author of Clarke's commentary, you may have seen that around, he identified the 4th beast with the Roman papacy, and he even went so far as to predict the end of the Roman papacy in 2016. Okay, so it's just around the corner. Very contemporary. Let's see how he goes. I'm pretty willing to bet that it's not going to come true, but yes. That was Luther, Roman papacy, same with Clarke. In more recent times, the early 1980s, Hal Lindsey has proclaimed that the 10-horn beast represents the European Economic Community, because at one point that had 10 nations within it. The European Economic Community, of course, is the antecedent for the European Union. So each interpreter has tried to view these images, these visions, through the lens of contemporary events of their own time. Are there things that we can affirm with this view? No, we need to get rid of it altogether. No. There is some good stuff actually that this view holds to.
Aaron, it's obvious. It was the French Revolution because the decimal system was introduced.
The decimal system? Where are you getting that from?
The 10 horns.
The 10 horns, okay. Well, that could be your take on that. What can we affirm about this view? The first thing, this approach recognises that biblical prophecy transcends its original context. Okay? And that it has a capacity to speak to various times and places and contexts. Okay? So that biblical prophecy is not something that should be simply locked up in the past about God's word to ancient Israel, but that in prophecy there is actually an ongoing word to God's people. Okay? That it's got something to say to us today. And I think that's something that we need to affirm. Like these guys think that the Bible prophecy has something to say to us today. I'd probably say it's got something different from them. But I would also want to affirm that what they're saying is right in the core, that they're wanting to say that yes, this text isn't a dead text. It's not something that's simply for ancient Israel, but it's got something that actually speaks to us today as well. So I think we need to affirm that. It also recognises that prediction is a key element in the work of the Old Testament prophets. That the Old Testament prophets actually are concerned with predicting events that are yet to come. So Amos announces judgment on the northern kingdom. Amos is roughly 750, judgment of the northern kingdom is 720. Now, it's not hundreds, thousands of years in the future, it's a couple of decades. But he's concerned with predicting what is yet to come. Isaiah looks forward and sees a return from exile in Babylon. Something that is, depending on how we look at Isaiah, but maybe 100 years in the future. He is concerned with predicting future events. So there are two things that this approach recognises well, I think. Prophecy has ongoing relevance, that prophets were actually concerned with predicting the future. It's just that the future for the prophets is the past for us. I'll get to that soon. Yeah. But there are also serious problems with this approach. Okay. Let me just talk about two. The first is that this approach actually limits the relevance of the biblical text. Okay. This approach limits the relevance of the biblical text. This is somewhat ironic because proponents of this approach are often concerned to show what? The relevance of the biblical text. They're often driven by a desire to show you how this text is relevant, how this text speaks into our day, our events, our crises. But I would actually argue that this approach, in fact, limits the relevance of the text. What it ends up doing is actually making the text less relevant to the vast majority of the population, and it also asserts that the text really wasn't relevant to the previous generation, and it's really not going to be relevant to ensuing generations. Why? Because it's talking about events that are happening here and now, in our time and our place. So by concretely identifying the prophetic visions and statements with events and realities in our own context, in our own time, we effectively rob these texts of their power to speak a word of encouragement and hope and rebuke to people no matter when or no matter where they live. Okay? So let's go back to the fourth beast of Daniel 7. Perhaps this is an image of militant Islam. Perhaps it's not. Perhaps this is a reference to the European Union. Perhaps it's not. But if that's all we're concerned about, if that's where we stop, if all we try to do is to set up some sort of one-to-one correlation between biblical prophecy and contemporary reality, we actually fail to grasp some things. We fail to grasp how the material may function paradigmatically. We fail to grasp how the text may shed light on the nature of evil and opposition to God whenever and wherever this may be encountered. And we thus fail to see how the text may speak into lives and situations of people who are suffering persecution under all kinds of oppressive regimes at all times and all places. We effectively take it down to a one-to-one correlation, and by doing, if we lock it down there, if all we're concerned about is seeing that one-to-one correlation, I think we actually fail to see how the text can speak to different times and different places and different contexts. So this approach, I think, limits rather than liberates the text to speak into different times and different places. So that's one of my critiques of this approach, that in trying to argue, trying to emphasise the relevance of the text, they in fact actually make it less relevant. A second concern that I have with this approach is that it fails to take account of the fact that the vast majority of Old Testament prophecy is directed to the prophet's own day, so he's speaking into contemporary events of his or her own time, or if he is predicting the future, it's the imminent future, 10, 20, 30, maybe 100 years down the track. There is an interesting set of statistics in a book by Fear and Stewart called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. They argue that less than 2% of Old Testament prophecy is messianic. You see what I was saying before, how we've taken one slice of what prophecy is? Yes, it's there, but we've turned it into the whole, and that's perhaps not as helpful as it could be. Less than 2% of Old Testament prophecy is messianic. Less than 5% specifically describes the New Covenant age. Less than 1% concerns events that are yet to come in our time. What's the total there if we add those up? 5, 2, and 1. 8% or so. 92% of Old Testament prophecy is concerned not with these things, not concerned with the Messiah, not primarily concerned with the New Covenant age, not primarily concerned with events that are yet to come in our time. It's primarily concerned with events in the prophet's own day or the prophet's near future. Okay. Now, we're going to get debate about stats, I know, and people will categorise things differently. That's fine. I mean, I'm not hinging on it being 2% as opposed to 3% or 4%. What that does, though, I think, is show quite clearly that the vast majority of prophecy, whether it's 92%, whether it's 80%, whether it's 70%, I don't really care. The vast majority is concerned with the prophet's own day, prophet's own time. And it's not like the first image. It's not all about predicting things that are happening now. Okay. Quick pause. Quick time for review. What are the 3 ways that I've suggested the prophets have been approached throughout history? First one, prophets are understood to be social reformers. Prophets are understood to be heralds of the Messiah. Third way, prophets are understood to be predictors of the future for them, predictors of our present. Okay. Let me introduce you to a 4th way of reading them. That the prophets are God's envoys. The basic way I think we need to understand Old Testament prophets is that they are envoys, or they are messengers from God to his people. This fell into line for me when I was reading through a passage out of Kings. Okay, if you want to jot it down, if you want to read it later, the key text is 2 Kings 18. I'll set you the scene for it. What's basically happened is that the Assyrian army, we've been talking a little bit about Assyria in some of the lectures we've been doing during the week. The Assyrian army has swept down into Israel and Judah. The Assyrian army is a tremendously powerful military force, and it goes through Judah and it captures virtually all of the significant cities, lays siege to them, captures them, deports part of the population. Lays siege to them. And what happens is that the king of the Assyrians marches on Jerusalem. Sorry, he doesn't actually go to Jerusalem. The Assyrian army lays siege to Jerusalem. He actually stays in another city called Lachish, but he sends his army to lay siege to Jerusalem. And as the Assyrian army sits encamped around the city of Jerusalem, a period of feverish diplomacy takes place. The key thing to note when you read this chapter is that the 2 kings, King Hezekiah of Judah and King Sennacherib of Assyria, they never actually meet in person. Okay? They don't hold a conference and engage in negotiations. It's not like the Yalta conference at the end of World War II, where all the great leaders get together and they actually flesh out the situation amongst themselves. They never actually meet. What do? They send messengers, they send their servants, they send their envoys, they send their diplomats who communicate their will to the opposing camp. And these diplomats, these envoys, function as delegates of their respective kings, and they carry the word from their king to the enemy. Let's look at some of the text more closely. This is just a portion of it. Stand back. Then the Rabshakeh stood. He's a key leader, maybe a general in the Assyrian army. He stood and called out in a loud voice in the language of Judah, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand. Do not let Hezekiah make you rely on the Lord by saying, the Lord will surely deliver us, and this city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me. Then each one of you will eat from your own vine, your own fig tree, and drink from your own cistern." I'll jump down to the next chapter. When King Hezekiah heard it, these are the words of the Rabshakeh, he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. And he sent Eliakim, who was in charge of the palace, and Shebna, the secretary and the senior priest, covered with sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos. They said to him, "Thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth." And the speech continues. In verse 5, when the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, "Say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Israel have reviled me." Do you see how it fits? Do you see how the Old Testament prophets are like the envoys that are coming from the king? The king, right at the top, the one who comes from the king of Assyria, the formula, "Thus says the king." Okay. When we get here, in verse 3, they said to him, "Thus says Hezekiah." When we get to the prophet, Isaiah says to your master, "Thus says the Lord." How is the prophet functioning? What is he exactly like? He's like a diplomat. But instead of coming from a human king or a human person who's in authority, he's coming from the Lord. He's the Lord's envoy. He's the Lord's diplomat. He's the Lord's messenger. I want to suggest that this is perhaps the best lens for understanding what an Old Testament prophet is. A prophet is not primarily a social reformer. A prophet is not primarily a herald of the Messiah. A prophet is not primarily, what was the third one I talked about? A predictor of present events. Prophet is primarily an envoy, a messenger from God, who is bringing God's word to God's people. And if this is the case, these figures of Fee and Stewart shouldn't surprise us. Because what is the task of a messenger? What is the task of an envoy? Is the task of an envoy to come and to tell the people about events that are going to be taking 2,000 years in the future? No, that's not the task of an envoy. The task of an envoy is to bring the message of the king to that people at that crisis at that point in time. Okay. This is the kind of message that the prophets bring. A message that speaks into the situation of the life of God's people at that time. Okay. So with this context in mind, how do I suggest we interpret the prophets today? Short answer to that is to buy my book, which is for sale at the end of tomorrow. Anyway. What I'll do now is I'll give you a really quick version of my book so you don't in fact have to buy it, okay? You'll understand the heart of what I've got to say. So how do we interpret the prophets today? I want to suggest that a good interpretive approach to the prophets is going to need to hold two things in tension. Okay? On one hand, we need to recognise that the prophetic books were addressed to an audience who lived at a different time and a different place from our own. Okay? We have to be conscious of that. They were speaking to a people who lived at a different time, a different place from our own. But we also need to recognise that they contain a message which has the potential to address audience living at different times and living at different places, including our own. So we need to hold these two things in tension, that they've got a message to a particular audience, a particular time, a particular place, but their message, in fact, will transcend that, okay? And it will continue to speak to us today. So we need to hold those two things in tension. One of the images I have is that we need to have a dual listening. We need to have stereo sound. We need to hear both the prophets as they spoke to their people, but we also need to hear, we need to listen to how they might be speaking to us today. So let's start with that first one, that we need to recognise that the prophetic books address an audience who lived at a different time, a different place. We need to locate the prophets in their day, in their time. We have to try to hear what the prophets were actually saying to their audience. Okay? That's how we do that first. We have to actually try to understand, hear what the prophets were actually saying to their audience. To do this well, I think you need to do two things. Okay? The first thing is that you need to develop an awareness of the original context the prophets were addressing. Okay? We need to develop an awareness of the context that the prophets were addressing. Prophets, in some of the books around biblical interpretation, are referred to as occasional literature. Okay? Prophets are occasional literature. What do they mean by that? That the prophets speak into specific occasions in the life of God's people. That the prophetic books are occasioned by certain crises, certain situations, certain problems in the life of God's people. We could say occasional, we could say they're situational. Okay? They're addressing certain situations, problems, crises in the life of God's people. If I'm to say that that's what the prophets' books are like, that they're occasional literature, what would you then say that they're like in terms of the New Testament? Which genre from the New Testament do they match probably most closely? Which genre, which kind of literature in the New Testament is highly occasional? The letters, that's right. The epistles of Paul. The letter to the Romans, the letter to the church in Galatia, the letters to the Thessalonians. They're all, again, highly occasional literature. They're being written to address specific crises in the church at Rome, specific crises at the church in Ephesus, problems at the church at Corinth. Okay? And to read those texts well, it's actually helpful to build up a bit of a picture of what was happening in Corinth or Rome or Ephesus. Okay? I just want to say that the same thing is true for the prophets. Okay? They are speaking into certain problems and crises and issues. And if that's the case, it's worth developing a bit of an awareness of the crises, the issues, the problems that they were addressing. Otherwise, it's kind of like one scholar talks about, it's kind of like trying to listen to one half of a telephone conversation. You know, you can kind of, if you're only hearing one half of a telephone conversation, you can kind of make out what it's about. You can kind of put it together. But if you could hear both sides, if you could get both people speaking, if you could hear the questions as well as the answers, you'd have a much better kind of picture of what's happening there. And so when we're dealing with the prophets, it's trying to build up as big a picture as we can to try to understand what are the crises, what are the questions they are concerned with responding to. Okay. So we need to develop a knowledge of the context the prophets were addressing. Furthermore, the prophetic books they include a lot of assumed knowledge on the part of their audience. They assume that their audience is going to pick up and understand social and historical and cultural references. They assume that their audience will be familiar with this, and therefore they don't need to explain it. Let's have a look at a couple of passages. Hosea 10:5-6. The inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Beth-aven. Its people shall mourn for it, and its idolatrous priests shall wail over its glory that has departed from it. The thing itself shall be carried to Assyria as tribute to the great king. Ephraim shall be put to shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his idol. If you were to actually work through that, you would realise that the prophet is actually assuming a whole lot of knowledge on the part of his audience. The reason that you may or may not be able to understand it is whether you share that knowledge or not. What's the key thing perhaps he's assuming his audience is going to know or appreciate? Anyone want to point it out? What do you reckon is the key thing? The calf of Beth-aven. That's right. That's kind of the thing that holds together that passage. He's assuming that his audience are going to know what he means when he talks about the calf of Beth-aven. Okay? It's assumed knowledge on his part. Here's another passage. This one's from Amos 4:1-3. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on Mount Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to their husbands, bring something to drink. The Lord God has sworn by his holiness. The time is surely coming upon you when they shall take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks. Through big breaches in the wall you shall lead, each one straight ahead, and you shall be flung out into Haram, says the Lord. The Lord is the prophet there is assuming a key piece of knowledge right at the start of the passage. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan. Okay? Who are these cows of Bashan that he's talking about here? He can assume that his original audience will pick it up, but we may or may not. And then a passage from Zephaniah. I will stretch out my hands against Judah and against all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And I will cut off from this place every remnant of Baal and the name of the idolatrous priests, those who bow down on the roofs to the host of heavens, those who bow down and swear to the Lord, but also swear by Milcom, those who have turned back from following the Lord, who have not sought the Lord, or inquired of him. Talking about things like Baal, the host of heaven, Milcom. Again, he's assuming that his audience is going to be familiar with these things. And so the prophets assume that their audience is going to possess a body of common knowledge that is going to grasp what they had to communicate. And that is a fair assumption on their behalf. I'm assuming that when I communicate with you, we're working with a certain level of common knowledge. Otherwise, I would have to go through and explain everything I was saying to you. Okay? But I can assume you're probably going to grasp a little bit about what I've got to say.
I'm really sorry.
That's fine.
I couldn't find it.
Okay. Prophets assume it, and that's fair enough, just like I can assume it. The problem is that the common knowledge for the prophet's audience is common knowledge no more. Okay? 2,500 years roughly separates us from the world of the prophets. And so how are we going to develop this kind of knowledge? It's not simply going to come through praying and reading about our Bible a little bit more. Okay? As important as that is, and I don't want to denigrate that, prayer and meditation is essential to Bible reading, but we're actually going to have to get out a Bible dictionary perhaps. We might have to get out a commentary or something like that that will help us understand what the prophet is trying to say. We're actually going to have to do a bit of historical research work. Look at a commentary, look at a Bible, look at the secondary sources. Or of course you could come to table.
Or read your book.
Or read my book. Okay, so I'm arguing that to hear the prophets well, to interpret the prophets well, it needs two things. One of those things is that we have to hear the prophets in their own time. We have to understand their message to their audience. To do that, we need to locate them in their context, and we need to develop some knowledge that's going to allow us to understand what they're talking about. Okay. The other thing that we need to do in terms of grasping the prophet's message for their day is to actually understand how they use language, how they communicate. We don't need to know necessarily, well, not just the content of what they've got to say, but we've also got to learn to read how they tried to say that. Okay? We've got to learn to appreciate their rhetoric, in other words, how they say what they have to say. A good example for me, to get my head around this, is the use of the Hebrew adverb olam, which is often translated, rightly or wrongly, as forever. Okay? Olam is often translated as forever or for all time. Now, when you see that, I'm assuming that you're going to be working with some sort of temporal knowledge, okay? Some temporal conception of forever. What does forever mean? Okay? Something beginning now and stretching into the indeterminate future, or something. That when we hear future, we think that when we hear forever, we think in terms of time. Okay? And so if that Hebrew word olam pops up, we think in terms of, this has to do with forever, it has to do with time. But in some contexts, it's clear that this is not how the term is being used. It's not being used with a temporal dimension, it's actually being used as an emphatic. Okay? And instead of translating it as forever, we should actually translate it as surely, or definitely, or certainly. And it's kind of a hyperbolic way of saying, this is forever. But really what he's trying to say is surely this is true, or certainly, or definitely. Let me give you an example of where we see this happening. Jeremiah 17. The sin of Judah is written with an iron pen. With a diamond point, it is engraved on the tablet of their hearts and on the horns of their altars. While their children remember their altars and their sacred poles beside every green tree and on the high hills, also a really interesting example of assumed knowledge of the audience, on the mountains in the open country. Your wealth and all your treasures I will give for spoil as the price of your sin throughout all your territory. By your own act you shall lose the heritage that I gave you. Here he's speaking to the covenant people of Judah before the exile. And I will make you serve your enemies in a land that you do not know, for in my anger a fire is kindled that shall burn forever. Okay. We have that Hebrew adverb popping up. Olam. Does the anger of the Lord burn forever against his people? Do they go into exile, never to be seen again? No. What is the prophet trying to say? God's very angry. God's very upset. God is certainly concerned. God is certainly angry with the way that you have been behaving. This is, a fire is certainly kindled against you. A fire is definitely kindled against you. Is a better way of understanding it than thinking in terms of this is something to do with how long the Lord's anger is going to be burning against his people. We need to be aware of the way that they used language. This is also an excellent example of prophetic hyperbole. What is hyperbole?
Exaggeration.
Yeah, deliberate exaggeration for the sake of effect. Hyperbole is very common in Old Testament prophecy. Okay? Why do you think they use hyperbole so much? Why do we use hyperbole?
Because you remember it better.
You remember it better?
Emphasise the point.
Emphasises the point. Has an emotional impact on the audience.
More dramatic.
It's more dramatic. That's right. You want to capture the audience. I caught a fish and it was this big. Okay? You're trying to engage them. You're trying to show off to them. And you're trying to convey the size, whatever. And so the prophets frequently use hyperbole because they're trying to affect, they're trying to move, they're trying to persuade their audience. They're trying to have an emotional impact. They want to convey the severity of the sin and the severity of God's impending judgment so that they can promote change. And hyperbole is a powerful way to do this. Yeah, Jesus uses hyperbole as well, to pluck out your eye. Probably hyperbole, although, yeah. What's the significance of all this? Well, I think we need to be careful about how literally we read Old Testament prophecy. Okay. When I say I caught a fish and it was this big, or when I say, as one of my students say, I've got a ton of homework, do they literally mean that they have got 1,000 kilograms of homework? No. They mean they've got a lot to get through. They're going to be up all night doing it, to which my response is, tough bickies, you've had all semester to get ready. Why did you leave it to the last minute? No, I'm much more gracious than that. Although that's sometimes what I think. So when God said his anger would burn forever, did he mean for us to take this literally? He was saying how angry he was. And so I think we have to be cautious in how literally we interpret Old Testament prophecy, that we don't expect fulfillment in each and every detail. So one of my pieces of advice for you when you're reading Old Testament prophecy is not to get too caught up in all the details. That can lead to all sorts of problems. My suggestion is that you focus on the big picture. You focus on the overall message of the prophet. Ask, what is the big idea? What is the big picture of the prophecy? What is the overall effect that this prophet is trying to create? And I think for me, this is an interesting and I think a helpful way of understanding and interpreting the Old Testament prophets. It's an example of impressionistic art. Now, if you were to look closely with this, you'll see that this is wonderfully crafted, that there is all these little dabs and strokes of paint. But if I want to appreciate really the beauty and what the artist was trying to convey, the best thing for me to do is to kind of step back from it a little bit and to try to get the big picture and try to appreciate how things blend together, how things work together, but to appreciate it as a whole. And I think that's a helpful way for us interpreting prophecy, is not to get caught up so much in looking at the individual dabs and the strokes, because we may well miss really what the prophet is trying to convey. A better thing for us is to step back and try to appreciate prophecy as a whole. What's the big picture the prophet is trying to convey through this message? What's the overall effect they're trying to have? So take a step back. Don't get so bogged down in the details that you fail to grasp the bigger picture. Okay. So that's listening to the prophets in their day. We've got to try to hear them in their original historical context. It's worth developing a knowledge of their assumed knowledge that they hope their audience will possess. And it's also being aware of the way that they use language. And that can come often simply through reading the prophets again and again and again and again, and actually picking up a sense of the rhythm of the language, the way that they use metaphors and similes, the way that they use exaggeration. That can often come through simply just reading the text and getting a feel for how they use words and phrases. Okay. So I said a good interpretive methodology listens to the prophets in their day, but we also need to locate the prophets in our day. And in order to do that, I know it's getting late, but I think you need to take on board an important semantic distinction. I've got it up there. Simply a use of prepositions. The prophets rarely speak of our day. Okay? By this I mean they rather rarely speak directly of events that are happening in our time. So they rarely predict, China as the power that is coming out of the east, or Egypt as the enemy from the south. Okay? They're not primarily talking about events, or they're not speaking of events that are happening in our time, but they frequently speak to the events, and they speak to our time. So what they have to say addresses our times, just as it has addressed Christians throughout history and all over the world. So I don't think they necessarily speak of our day, but they do speak to our day. And one way that I think that we can hear them speaking to our day, this is one way that I think is potentially helpful. There is other possibilities, but one way that I think we can hear them speak to our day is to adopt what I refer to as a paradigmatic approach to these texts, okay? Based on the word paradigm. A paradigmatic approach to these texts. This approach is based on the assumption that the Old Testament prophets contain paradigms of God's presence, purpose, and power, as well as paradigms of human response to the divine presence and purpose. So what I'm trying to say there is that the prophetic books give us recurrent pictures of divine behaviour, of divine purpose, of divine activity in the world. The prophets give us a bit of a picture of how God characteristically relates to his people. So they give us a bit of a paradigm for the way in which God is at work in the world. How he behaves, his purpose, his activity, how he relates to his people. The prophetic books also give us insights into what God characteristically expects of his people. They give us insights into the priorities that God has. And on this basis, the fact that it gives us an image of how God characteristically relates and also an image of what God characteristically expects of his people, we may be able to assume, or we may be able to extrapolate how God may be at work in the church and the world today, and what God may expect of his people today. That's the theory. In practice, what I think it involves is us asking questions like this. These are the questions that I think we should be asking when we read prophets. We shouldn't be asking, how is this event, or how is this prophecy fulfilled in the events of our day? Okay? These are some of the more helpful questions I think we need to ask. How is God's character and activity portrayed in this passage? Why does God intend to act in this fashion? What is God calling people to be and do in this passage? Why are they called to act in this fashion? And in the light of the above, how might we expect God to be at work in our world today? How might this text shape the life and the faith of the people of God today? So those first series of questions is talking about God's activity in the world. How is God at work in the world back then? How might he be at work in the world today? And the second thing is, what does God expect of his people back then? What are God's characteristic expectations? And how might those be embodied today in the life of the people of faith? This means that when we get to a text like Daniel 7, that image of the four beasts, our ultimate goal is not to figure out the identity of the beasts, as important as that may or may not be. But we also need to consider how the text serves paradigmatically, how it tells us about God's triumph over tyranny and the forces which oppose him, and thus how the text can serve as a source of encouragement to the people who are living in the midst of crisis, no matter their time or their place. How do we see that text embodying things which are true, which have an ongoing resonance for us? So to conclude, winding up. To conclude, we could ask ourselves the question, what can the Old Testament prophets tell us about today? I don't know about you, but I often go past churches which have got a sign, the Old Testament the prophets are saying this about events of today. What can the Old Testament prophets tell us about today? On one level, or from one angle, I would want to answer, not much. Not much, in the sense that they're not focused on predicting events which are taking place in our day. What can they tell us about today? Not much, because they're not really concerned with predicting events that are taking place in our day. But on another, a perhaps more important and profound level, however, I would want to argue quite a lot, that they actually tell us quite a lot about it. They tell us about a God who is passionately concerned with justice, who cares for the oppressed and the powerless. They tell us about a God who hates evil, both in the life of the covenant people and those outside of it. A God who is determined to act against this evil. A God who is determined to bring restoration to those who have suffered. A God who places demands on his worshippers and who expects them to live in certain ways, ways which accord with his will. And in this way, I believe, the prophetic message is in fact more relevant. It's relevant in a deeper and truer sense than if the prophets had foretold our story like gypsies telling the future, or like clairvoyants predicting events that are taking place. The message they declare is important, not because they give us a picture of events that are taking place in our day, but because they give us an image. They give us a glimpse into who God is and the priorities that God has. And in that sense, they are truly relevant. So the prophets may not speak of contemporary events and realities, but the message they declare certainly speaks to them. They may not speak of our day, but they speak to our day. And if you want to know more, there's a sale at the back. But as I said before, that's really the heart of the book. Okay. I think slightly over time, a little bit longer than I hoped I would. I'm quite open though to having a time of questions, responses, your own perspectives on the prophets. I'm quite excited to hear those as well. Is there anything that people want to question? Is there anything that people want to share? Is there anything that they would like more clarity around? I'm happy to. Scott?
Aaron, given that the prophets are primarily Jews and Israelites talking about the nature of God,
Yeah.
and whilst only about a percentage of them are talking about the messianic reality,
Yeah.
how much do they then, though, play into the identifying of not only the Messiah but also godly people today?
Yeah.
And how does not accrediting their voice today rob us
Yeah.
of a much broader sense of God's presence?
Yeah. How does not listening to their voice rob us of a broader voice, a broader perspective on God's work? I can answer that in terms of a personal illustration. I grew up in a pretty typical conservative evangelical family, okay? And I thank God for that. That gave me a great rooting, I think a great solid basis in the faith. But for me, the gospel, God's work, was all about the salvation of souls, about getting to people to heaven. I then took an Old Testament prophets course at Tabor. It was the best course I ever took. It was actually the reason I became so passionate about the Old Testament, the prophets in particular, was because through struggling with these texts, I was given a greater realisation of the breadth of God's concern for his people. Okay? That God is, yes, he's concerned about people having a relationship with him. He wants people to be faithful to him. But he's also really concerned about how we live in our day-to-day lives. He's not concerned just with Sunday. He's concerned with our economic practices on Monday. He's concerned with how we use power. He's concerned with how we relate to the poor and the marginalised. So my concern is that my experience comes about because of a neglect of texts like this, and that if we don't struggle with texts like this, we can end up with a very anemic gospel, which is all about my relationship with God, as important as that is, and I'm being video recorded, so I want to make sure that I get that point. That is important. But at the same time, there is more to the gospel narrative as well. There is more to the gospel story. There is more to God's concern. Relationship with him, yes, is important. But as I was trying to say before, that Israelite conception, that true religion is not only about my relationship with God, but also my relationship with my neighbour, is something that I think comes through emphatically. And for me, that was the real revelation that I had when I started to struggle with the prophets. Anything else?
Aaron, many of the texts I think are very strongly monotheistic,
Yeah.
and strongly portraying the view that God is sovereign and all-powerful and all that. How do you relate that then within the current context, which would want to say that there are many gods, or many ways of understanding spirituality, and working within contexts where I'm constantly encountering people with a whole range of what that means for them. And then the personalness, the personal relationship aspect of God, I guess, is an aspect that I wonder where is that in the prophets?
Well, the prophets actually give us some of the most... In some ways, the prophets actually give us the best image in terms of a person's struggle with God and relationship with God. The example that I think there is really beneficial is a text like Jeremiah. Jeremiah, perhaps of all the books in the Old Testament, gives us an insight into a Old Testament believer's struggle with God, his relationship with God, and the challenges and the crises that actually brings. So in that sense, Jeremiah at least is really helpful. A lot of the Old Testament as a whole really isn't concerned with the struggles of the individual. Okay? The Old Testament as a whole is generally concerned with the struggles of the nation. Okay? And so you think of, you know, the story from really Genesis all the way through to 2 Kings is all about the birth of the nation, the growth of the nation, entering into a covenant. It's about the failure of the kings and the nations as a whole. It's about the judgment that comes on the nation. So the Old Testament as a whole probably has more of a corporate focus on the people of God. So a book like Jeremiah is actually really important to be in it because it does give us that more personal, that more intimate perspective of a believer's relationship and the struggles and the crises. And for Jeremiah, it's not an easy thing. In fact, he finds God to be somewhat overpowering at times in terms of the way that the relationship that he has with him. In terms of how it speaks in the context of other religions, other faiths, the prophets themselves don't give those things. Well, there's 2 ways of understanding that. One is to say that the prophets are primarily concerned with the covenant relationship between Yahweh and his people. So they are concerned with the faithfulness of the covenant people. The prophets are addressing the people of God. They're addressing the Israelites. And so by extension, they're addressing us today. The prophets are not really concerned, although we looked at Jeremiah, I know in the lectures, but the prophets, generally speaking, are not concerned with how people outside of the faith are necessarily practicing their religion. There is some of that. Jeremiah, I know Jonah does that, and I know a lot of the prophetic books actually have oracles against Babylon and Assyria and those kinds of things. But the vast majority of their books are concerned with the life of the community of faith. So they're not concerned with addressing Muslims, and they're not concerned with addressing people who come from a different context. They're concerned with how is the people of God relating to their God. Okay? So, how does it address those issues? Well, I don't know if it really does necessarily. How does it address today? It's speaking to us. It's speaking to the community's faith. It's speaking to the trials and the challenges that we face. The other way of looking at it is that the prophets, as you say, well, at least certainly by the time we get to Isaiah, they're quite staunchly monotheistic. They believe in one God. Whether that was the true earlier in Israel's history is a matter of scholarly debate. There is some suggestion that there is passages in the Old Testament that actually acknowledges the presence of other supernatural beings, if you want to talk in that way. But certainly the prophets have a very narrow view. Certainly by the time we get to Isaiah, they have a narrow view that there is only one God. There is Yahweh, that he is the one to be worshipped. And therefore, they don't have a lot of time for other religions and other faiths. And they, in some passages, they quite openly mock people who believe in idols. You know, how could you believe that? How could that be your worship? And so, yeah, they don't really have a lot of time for those other faiths and those other religions. Why? Because that's not really their concern. Their concern is with the covenant people themselves. Their concern is addressing how Israel is going, whether they're being faithful in their journey.
Prescriptively pushing that into our language today then is stop worrying about other religions and get on with being the best Christians we can be. Yeah,
that's right. Part of the problem with the prophets is that when we hear prophetic preaching, certainly in a North American context, prophetic preaching is about saying what's wrong in society. Okay, that we've got to look out for the marginalised. That look at how the president is leading the nation. Okay, prophetic preaching is about attacking what's out there happening in the world. But actually, prophetic preaching is about addressing the covenant community. It's about addressing how you and I are using power. It's about how you and I are looking after the marginalised within our families, within our communities. So to say prophetic preaching, so that for me is a problem in terms of how the language is used. I can't remember how I got there. It was connected to something that you said, but that for me is a problem. And so what we're going to be concerned, the prophets are concerned with how are we going. Let's get our game right. Let's make sure that we are being the people of God in a true, authentic and faithful way. And then perhaps let's talk about what's happening outside. But really, our primary concern has got to be what's happening in our churches. How are we going? Okay. I will hang around now. If you'd like to come up and have a chat with me and unpack anything with me, I'm happy to do that. But I also appreciate that time is moving on, and if you'd like to leave, then by all means do so.